The year was 1944, and Private Giuseppe Benedetto could hardly believe what he was seeing. Standing in the recreation hall at Jackson Barracks in New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward, he watched American soldiers escort 50 young Italian American women into the building. The women, dressed in their finest clothes, despite having to climb up into military trucks, were laughing and chatting as they entered what had been, until that moment, strictly a prisoner of war facility. Giuseppe had been captured in Tunisia just over a year earlier, along with hundreds of thousands of other Italian soldiers who found themselves abandoned by Mussolini's regime in the North African desert. Like most of his fellow prisoners, he had actually felt relief when British forces captured his unit. They had been fighting without adequate food, water, or ammunition for months. What followed was a journey that none of the Italian prisoners could have imagined. Instead of the harsh treatment they expected as enemies of the Allied forces, they found themselves on ships bound for America, a country most had only heard about in stories. When Giuseppe first arrived at Jackson Barracks, he was issued an American military uniform, identical to those worn by U.S. soldiers, except for one crucial difference: a green oval patch on the sleeve that read Italy. This was part of the Italian Service Units program, established in March 1944 after Italy officially surrendered and joined the Allied cause in September 1943. The transformation from enemy prisoner to co-belligerent worker had been remarkable enough. Giuseppe and nearly 45,000 other Italian POWs had signed loyalty oaths and were now contributing to the American war effort, earning wages and enjoying freedoms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But what was happening this particular Saturday evening in 1944 seemed to defy all conventional wisdom about prisoner of war treatment. The event had been organized by 17-year-old Marguerite Grognani, secretary of the Ladies' Auxiliary Club at the Italian Hall on Esplanade Avenue. A military representative had approached her with an unusual request. Could she organize a group of local Italian-American girls to come to Jackson Barracks for a dance with the Italian POWs, similar to the USO dances held for American servicemen? Marguerite had made phone calls throughout the French Quarter's Little Palermo neighborhood, where many Sicilian immigrant families lived. The response was overwhelming. These families understood what it meant to be far from home, and their hearts went out to the young Italian men who were thousands of miles from their families. The first thing that struck Giuseppe about the American approach to prisoner treatment was the food. Unlike the meager rations he had endured in North Africa, the Americans provided abundant meals. When the Italian prisoners complained about unfamiliar American food, the U.S. Army actually allowed them to cook their own traditional meals. Giuseppe had become one of the camp cooks, which meant he missed that first dance while preparing dinner for his fellow prisoners. As the evening progressed, Giuseppe could hear Italian music drifting from the recreation hall. The POWs had organized their own band, with musicians among the prisoners playing familiar songs from home. The sound of laughter and conversation in both English and Italian filled the barracks, a sound that would have been impossible to imagine just a year earlier. The dance was such a success that it became a regular weekly event. But the real breakthrough came the following Sunday, when some of the young women returned with their families for visiting hours. The U.S. Army, recognizing the positive effect these visits had on prisoner morale, officially sanctioned supervised visits every Sunday afternoon. Giuseppe remembered the first time he met 20-year-old Rosa Battaglia, one of 7 sisters from a Sicilian-American family in the French Quarter. Rosa had come to the barracks with her older sister to visit with the prisoners, bringing homemade cookies and speaking in the Sicilian dialect that reminded Giuseppe so much of his grandmother back in Italy. What made these interactions possible was the unique status the Italian POWs had achieved. Unlike German prisoners, who remained classified as enemy combatants throughout the war, the Italians had become co-belligerents after their country's surrender. This meant they were no longer technically enemies, but weren't quite allies either. It was a gray area that American military commanders interpreted with surprising flexibility.
The 1929 Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required humane treatment but said nothing specific about social interactions with local civilians. American military leaders dealing with severe labor shortages on the home front found that happy, well-treated prisoners were far more productive workers than sullen, resentful ones. Captain James Morrison, the commanding officer at Jackson Barracks, had initially been skeptical about allowing civilian visits, but reports from other POW camps around the country suggested that prisoners with regular contact with local Italian-American communities were less likely to cause disciplinary problems and more willing to contribute to the war effort. The policy wasn't without controversy. Andrew J. Higgins, whose boat-building company employed 20,000 workers in New Orleans and whose landing craft were crucial to Allied victories in Europe and the Pacific, was vocal in his opposition to what he called coddling of enemy prisoners. In August 1944, Higgins wrote to Louisiana's congressional delegation expressing his outrage that Italian prisoners have the freedom of the streets and are even entertained at bathing parties on Lake Pontchartrain. But for Giuseppe and his fellow Italian POWs, these social interactions represented something far more significant than mere entertainment. They were a bridge back to humanity after years of war, deprivation, and separation from everything familiar. The Sunday visits followed strict protocols. The women always came with chaperones, usually older family members who could serve as interpreters. Many of the young Italian-American women spoke little or no Italian, while most of the POWs spoke minimal English. Mothers and grandmothers became essential intermediaries in what were often the beginnings of romantic relationships. Giuseppe found himself looking forward to Sundays with an anticipation he hadn't felt since before the war. Rosa would arrive with her mother, and the three of them would sit in the day room sharing stories about their families and their hopes for the future. Giuseppe learned that Rosa worked as a seamstress in the French Quarter, while she discovered that he had been studying engineering before the war interrupted his education. The courtship rituals that developed were unlike anything seen before in American military history. Young men who were technically prisoners of war were courting American citizens with the full knowledge and approval of the U.S. Army. The relationships were conducted under constant supervision, but they were genuine romantic connections nonetheless.
Other camps around the country were developing similar programs, but each had its own character based on local attitudes toward the Italians. In some East Coast locations, where memories of Italy's role as an Axis power were stronger, the interactions were more formal and limited. In the Midwest, particularly in states like Utah and Michigan, the POWs enjoyed even greater freedoms, sometimes being allowed to leave camp under escort for community events. But nowhere was the integration as complete as in New Orleans, where the large Sicilian-American community saw the POWs not as former enemies, but as paesani, countrymen who happened to be caught on the wrong side of history. The relationship between Giuseppe and Rosa deepened over months of Sunday visits. By the spring of 1945, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. He wanted to marry her. But proposing to an American woman while still technically a prisoner of war required navigating uncharted territory. Giuseppe approached Rosa's mother first, explaining his intentions in the formal manner expected in traditional Italian families. Rosa's mother, who had grown fond of the respectful young man, agreed to help facilitate the proposal. The actual proposal took place in the day room at Jackson Barracks, with Rosa's mother serving as translator, since Giuseppe's English was still limited and Rosa spoke no Italian. Their story was far from unique. At Jackson Barracks alone, at least 10 documented marriages eventually resulted from relationships that began during those supervised visits. The Battaglia family became legendary in the camp. 4 of the 7 sisters eventually married Italian POWs. Giovanni Di Stefano, who spoke multiple languages and often served as an interpreter, married Virgie Battaglia. Lorenzo Nuzzolillo married Eleanor, known as Nani. Eugenio Chierici married Concetta, called Tini. And Lorenzo Giacontieri
married Mariana, known as Annie. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Jackson Barracks. At Camp Ploush, in nearby Harahan, similar relationships were forming. Giovanni Munfrin, a POW at that facility, courted and eventually married Anna Mae Cassesi. The pattern was repeated at POW camps from California to Massachusetts, wherever Italian service units were stationed and local Italian-American communities existed. But these relationships faced a significant challenge as 1945 progressed and the war moved toward its conclusion. The Geneva Convention required that all prisoners of war be repatriated to their home countries once hostilities ended. For the Italian POWs and their American sweethearts, this meant an agonizing separation with no guarantee they would ever see each other again. The day of departure in December 1945 was heartbreaking for everyone involved. Giuseppe stood at the window of the train that would take him to a ship bound for Italy, looking down at Rosa and her family gathered on the platform. The scene was repeated dozens of times along the length of the train, as other couples said what might be their final goodbyes. Dorothy Messina, who had fallen in love with POW Hermano Diamarcio, later recalled that moment. I saw him get on the truck and he was looking down at me and we were waving. The girls that had boyfriends going back were all crying. When I got back home, it was such an empty feeling. It was horrible. And the minute I opened the door, there was a dozen American Beauty roses. The card read, "I love you and I will be back." But the story didn't end with that painful separation. The relationships that had formed in the unlikely setting of prisoner of war camps proved to be remarkably durable. Giuseppe and Rosa, like many other couples, had made commitments to each other that transcended the circumstances of war.
The process of reuniting was complicated by immigration laws and international regulations. Italian men who wanted to return to America to marry their sweethearts faced quotas and restrictions. American women who wanted to travel to Italy to marry their POW boyfriends needed chaperones and substantial financial resources for what was then an expensive and difficult journey. Giuseppe returned to Italy to find his homeland devastated by years of war. Cities were in ruins, the economy was shattered, and opportunities for young men were limited. The contrast with the abundance he had witnessed in America was stark and depressing. Meanwhile, Rosa was making novenas, repeated prayers, for what seemed like an impossible reunion. Long-distance communication was unreliable, and the bureaucratic obstacles to bringing Giuseppe back to America seemed insurmountable. But love and determination proved stronger than bureaucracy. In 1947, after nearly 2 years of separation, Rosa's family managed to arrange the necessary paperwork and financing for her to travel to Italy. She took her first airplane flight, leaving New Orleans for the first time in her life to marry Giuseppe in a ceremony that brought together American determination and Italian tradition. The wedding took place in Giuseppe's hometown, with Rosa wearing a dress she had sewn herself and Giuseppe in a suit borrowed from a cousin. After a brief honeymoon touring Italy, the newlyweds prepared for the journey back to America, where Giuseppe would build a new life as an American citizen. Their story was repeated dozens of times across the country. Dorothy Messina and her sister Mary traveled to Italy as part of a group of American women whose POW fiancés were waiting for them. Dorothy and Hermano Dimarzio and Mary and Antonio Pezzana were married in a double ceremony at the same cathedral in Cefalù, Sicily, where the sisters' parents had been married 50 years earlier. Marguerite Graffignani, the young woman who had organized that first dance at Jackson Barracks, also traveled to Italy to marry Mario Moranto, a POW from Padua. She was just 20 years old when she made her first airplane flight to join the man she had fallen in love with behind the barbed wire fence of a prisoner of war camp. These marriages represented more than just individual love stories. They were evidence of a remarkable experiment in treating former enemies with humanity and dignity. The American decision to allow Italian POWs to integrate into local communities, to form genuine relationships with American citizens, and ultimately to build new lives in America was unprecedented in the history of warfare. The policy wasn't without its critics, both during the war and afterward. Some Americans questioned whether it was appropriate to allow enemy soldiers, even former enemies, such freedoms.
Others worried about the security implications of giving foreign military personnel access to American communities and citizens. But the results spoke for themselves. The Italian service units contributed over 90 million man-days of labor to the American war effort. The men worked in factories, on farms, and in construction projects that were essential to maintaining the home front while American men were fighting overseas. Their productivity levels were consistently high, and disciplinary problems were minimal. More importantly, the program demonstrated that treating prisoners with dignity and respect produced better outcomes than harsh treatment. The Italian POWs who married American women became some of the most loyal and productive American citizens of their generation. Giuseppe and Rosa settled in New Orleans, where Giuseppe used his engineering background to start a construction company. They raised 3 children who grew up hearing stories of their parents' unlikely courtship in a prisoner of war camp. Giuseppe became active in veterans organizations and immigrant rights groups, always grateful for the country that had given him not just freedom, but love and a new life.
The story of Giuseppe and Rosa, multiplied dozens of times across the American landscape, stands as testimony to the power of treating former enemies as potential friends. In choosing to see Italian POWs not just as prisoners to be guarded, but as human beings capable of love, loyalty, and contribution to American society, the United States created one of the most successful prisoner reintegration programs in military history. Today, visitors to New Orleans can still find descendants of those wartime romances. They are business owners, teachers, doctors, and community leaders whose grandparents met in the most unlikely of circumstances, a prisoner of war camp where love was allowed to bloom. Their presence in American communities is a living reminder that the best victories in war are often won not on battlefields, but in the human heart's capacity for forgiveness, understanding, and love. The Italian POWs who couldn't believe Americans let them date local women discovered something remarkable. In America, even former enemies could find not just freedom, but family. It was a lesson in the power of treating people with dignity, regardless of the uniform they once wore or the flag they once served. And it created families whose very existence proves that love, given the chance, can indeed conquer all. Their marriage lasted 53 years until Giuseppe's death in 2000. Rosa often said that she never regretted that first decision to climb up into a military truck and attend a dance at Jackson Barracks. "It was the best decision I ever made," she would tell her grandchildren. "Your grandfather was worth waiting for, even if it meant falling in love with a prisoner of war." The broader implications of the Italian POW experience in America extended far beyond individual love stories. The program represented a new approach to post-conflict reconciliation, demonstrating that former enemies could become friends, neighbors, and family members. The success of the Italian service units influenced American policies toward prisoners in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War and later conflicts, American military leaders remembered the lessons learned from treating Italian POWs with dignity and allowing them to maintain connections to civilian communities. The experience also contributed to changing American attitudes toward immigration and assimilation. The Italian POWs who stayed in America and became citizens proved that people could successfully transition from enemy to ally to American, given the right circumstances and opportunities. For the Italian-American community, the POW marriages represented a unique chapter in their ongoing integration into American society. The relationships demonstrated that Italian Americans were fully American while still maintaining connections to their heritage. By welcoming former Italian soldiers into their families, they were affirming both their American patriotism and their Italian cultural identity. The children and grandchildren of these POW marriages grew up with a unique perspective on war, peace, and national identity. They understood that their very existence was the result of American policies that prioritized humanity over revenge, integration over isolation.
Looking back, the decision to allow Italian POWs to date local women might seem like a small detail in the vast scope of World War II. But for the thousands of individuals whose lives were transformed by these relationships, it represented something profound. The possibility that even in the midst of the world's most destructive war, human connections could transcend national boundaries and political divisions.